So I didn't grow up in Chicago, so I was wondering if you could tell me what was going on in Chicago in 1968.
In 1968, which was already later on in my involvement, but there was massive racism, and there was a lot of protest against the Vietnam War, but there was a horrific response at all levels, not just from government and police, but people in neighborhoods, fathers refusing to deal with their sons and all this. It was just such a boiling pot of issues and civil rights that it was swirling all around.
So can you tell me about the Democratic Convention?
Yes. I had just graduated and was going to start as a school teacher, so I wasn't going to get involved. But the first night of the convention, National Guard Jeeps put barbed wire screens on their Jeeps and were rushing into the crowd. And I thought it was so horrible I had to go down there and see what was going on. And then the continued persecution and beating and tear gassing, even when not necessary, was just overwhelming. And that's what was going on. It was this outrageous war that we were involved in. And here's the most important thing. So many of the people who were protesting it were doing it because they felt patriotic and that these people were violating American standards. We didn't hate America. There were some left-wingers and some of the leaders were radicals and so on, but most of the people involved were doing this because of our constitutional rights and because of the abuse that we were doing to people around the world. And that's what drew people into this opposition.
What was the conversation like at Roosevelt when all these things were going on?
There were a lot of people who were demonstrating and a lot of people who had no interest in it. One of my most memorable experiences here at Roosevelt was when a hippie was talking to a Vietnam War vet already, because the war had started earlier, and he was a student here. And the hippie started screaming at him and pulled out a straight edge razor, which is where you had the razor blade folded into the handle and you could pull it out, and he was about to strike the veteran when a couple of us tackled him down and took the knife away from him. And both sides were here, but at least this was one place where people could talk about how they felt. On the other hand, I was in a theater group here and we practiced late at night, and if we looked out of the window on the 7th floor down into the alley that goes by the side of the building, we would see police arresting people and knocking the hell out of them. So there was just so much going on. Students were members of all these different organizations, SNCC and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SOS, and the civil rights organizations, the black organizations, and so forth. And so there were just all these different connections to students and faculty.
You were potentially going to get drafted and you were working. Can you tell me more about that?
The first time I got my induction papers, I was a 4-year student here. I just sent it in and they didn't draft me. The second time, they changed the law, and as long as you were pursuing a full-time undergraduate degree, you couldn't be arrested. And I was in my 5th year taking all these education courses so that I could become a school teacher. And I got my induction papers and my appeal was rejected, so it went up to an appellate level. And since the law had just changed, I won again. But when I went down to the draft board, one of the questions was, have you ever committed a crime? Well, I had been arrested once for selling ice cream without a license. It was never any charge place, and they put me in a lockup. Roosevelt was one of the few places that had active black students at that time and so on.
Do you feel like what was happening in Chicago is representative of what was happening across the nation?
I wouldn't have known that until the main Vietnam War stuff started, but yes, it was going on in many, many places.
My specific research interest or area of interest is sex trafficking, I did my summer McNair research project on specialized officers and their experiences with sex trafficking. And I grew up in Portland, Oregon, where the issue is pervasive. With the coast, there's a lot of international trafficking, and in the city, there's a really high homeless population of young people, and so it's really hard for their law enforcement to tell who's a victim of trafficking and who's not. So I learned about it in my high school, and I ended up doing a senior project, and it's just been my passion ever since. I have this feeling of I know what's happening, and I feel responsible for doing something about it. So when I got into McNair, and Mike Malley actually convinced me that this passion of learning about it could be something that I could do for the rest of my life. And so I did my research project, and I interviewed, and I learned that they don't have trainings. Specialized officers don't go through any specialized training. They learn on the job from other detectives, and it's completely procedural. They don't learn the psychological effects of trauma. They don't learn the effects of this sort of stuff, and they get no psychological perspective or empathetic perspective. It's just a job. And so that bothered me a lot. I had a really hard time just sitting with that. So I decided to do an honors thesis, and I'm right now writing a handbook on police officer trainings for victims of long-term victimization.
No one has any concept of how much of it is going on in Chicago right now.
Yeah.
And how much of it isn't just women deciding to do this, but is exploitation.
Yep.
And nobody hears about it. My perspective, and it comes a little bit from being a criminal lawyer and meeting women who've been involved in this, but is that the mentality of the women involved really often is, what choice do I have? It's not that they like it or they want to make money off of it. It's this is my only way to go forward, and it's just being ignored these days.
It's amazing to me just how calculated and manipulative traffickers are, and how they're able to convince someone that they're doing this voluntarily, even though that's absolutely a coercion. They just say all the right things and prey on all the right vulnerabilities that pretty soon these girls feel like they're doing it on their own, and they're doing it because this is what they want their life to be. And by the time they have nowhere else to go, that's their only option. And so it's actually really difficult for law enforcement to deal with victims, because it has to be voluntary under the law, and they have to consent to a criminal investigation. So they don't feel that they're a victim of anything, so they don't accept help, they don't accept any of the services that they're given under the law, and victims can't get them to testify against their traffickers. Out here, I'm still kind of learning the ropes of the different organizations that are out here. I'm working with CASE right now. I don't have a lot of extra time, but I am working with the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. And my research faculty that I'm looking at here in Chicago is up at Loyola, and she's actually interviewing pimps about how they use the internet to find victims.
How important do you think it is to give these young women a chance to express what they're going through?
I think it's so important. When you experience anything in your life, you tend to try to find a person who knows what you're talking about. And when you're a victim of such a specific trauma, I can't imagine what it's like to have to tell your story to someone who has no idea what that's like. You know, when you've had someone exploit you, and you've been through gang rape and prostitution and pornography and all of these really physically traumatic experiences, you just want someone who knows what that's like and knows what it's like to try to recover from that. Because experiencing long-term trauma, you don't just wake up one day and decide that you're over it. It's a series of events over the course of your life that helps you get through these things, and you're haunted by it forever. It hurts my soul, you know? The thing about trafficking that gets me every time is this specific quote by a trafficker that was written in his book that anyone can go buy on Amazon right now. And in one singular paragraph, this man is able to take a human being and turn him into an object. And every time I think of someone exploiting someone sexually or physically or emotionally, that's taking a human being and not seeing them as a human being. That's seeing them as an object that they can use for their own personal gain. And that just like, it just grates on me every time I think about it. And all of these people in the media that we idolize and look at as heroes that are doing the same thing to other people, but we're still putting them on a pedestal. It shows something about our culture and society, I think.
Well, one of the things I'm interested in is women's perspectives. Sometimes we know what the men's perspective is, but the one woman who was interviewed said, well, all men are like that. I'm just wondering if you've heard that before from women, that we have no choice.
I've heard it a lot, and that's who we're supposed to be, that's what our identity is supposed to be, is how men look at us. I grew up in a small white Christian neighborhood, and my grandma still can't believe that I'm not married, like at 20 years old. How is that possible? And it's just like the idea that an education is more important to me than a relationship is still really hard for some people in my family to grasp. And that like that's not what women are supposed to be. That's kind of heartbreaking, you know?
How does your connection to Roosevelt affect your perspective of these issues?
Roosevelt has changed my perspective so much. Part of it is just moving from one part of the country to another and seeing how some of those social issues are different. But Roosevelt is a place where you can come and talk about things, like you said earlier, issues that we don't understand or we don't have the perspective of. I took a psychology of racism course, and my stepdad is black, my step-siblings are black, and so I've heard their experiences about it. But hearing some of the people who just, there's like specific words that they feel triggered by, or things that they've experienced that I will never have a concept of, that's something that I'm able to ask them about. And we were able to talk about our own prejudice. Like when you're on a train and there's someone who's scaring you, what do you do when you're like, oh, this is a black man on a train, he's gonna hurt me? Like looking at those biases and examining them. This is a place where you can come and do that. I think that's really important, because we'll never be able to make a progress or make a change if we're not able to talk about them analytically first.
I came from the northwest side of Chicago. I was raised in an all-white, very racist, no blacks, no Muslims neighborhood. And then I end up at Roosevelt and felt this diversity for the first time in reality every day. And the trick was to get me to shut up and listen to other people's stories, but it was very meaningful just to hear what people were going through every day.
I personally believe everyone should move away from their hometown at one point. My mom has lived in the Pacific Northwest her whole life, and when she came to Chicago for the first time, she couldn't believe how different it is.
What do you expect to do now when you complete that PhD next week?
I'm still applying. I'm not crying about it. And my goal is to get my PhD in either criminal justice or forensic psychology, and I want to study sex trafficking. There are a few people who are doing it, and they're amazing and wonderful, but most of the research that's quoted in like big media is done by nonprofits. So it's extremely biased and focused on what they need in order to make a difference. And there's also, in my personal research, I've found a very strong disconnect between what's happening in the field and what academics are saying is happening in the field. Personally, in my literature review, I found this thing called the arrest to assist model. And all of these academics were saying that police officers arrest victims in order to keep them safe. And that's pretty much the exact opposite of what the TVPA says, and the exact opposite of getting them services. And so that's how I structured my interview for the officers that I interviewed. And neither one of them had any idea what I was talking about. They both told me that's the least helpful thing you could do for a victim, that they have to do this voluntarily in order for anything to be effective. And so I didn't have any interview questions left because I had built it all around this literature review I had done, and they were like laughing at me because I couldn't speak to them eloquently. And I think that goes to show that academics live in this they live in a different world. They think that they understand an issue, but we have no idea what's actually happening in the field and how these people are actually implicated by it. And that's where I feel academics sit in such a great seat for activism, and then they don't. And I don't understand that.
There's always a struggle on all these issues. And that's another part of my experience from being at Roosevelt, is that whether it was Vietnam War or civil rights or women's abuse, that there's different sides and experiences to these stories, which not only have to be heard, but have to be understood. And very often the left wing back then didn't want to have anything to do with those horrible people on the other side.
I think that that's so important, and it's a shame that that's not why we're using Facebook and Instagram and these platforms to share stories. We're using social media to be mean to one another and to boost our own personal gain instead of sharing stories like this and making things known. Like, social media could be such a effective platform, and same with mass media. We're portraying victims of prostitution in such a specific way that now people don't understand what they're supposed to be looking for in their kids or their nieces and nephews who could be a victim. They're looking for such a specific archetype, but that's not what it always looks like.
Sometimes it would be a parent, and one was a prominent parent who sexually exploited his daughters and so forth. It was just unbelievable to see it, and people, they'd always think it's the girls that are tramps. Yep. And there was so much more to it than that. But I appreciate what you just said about stories. I was actually this past weekend on a retreat, and the theme, we were up in Wisconsin, the theme was storytelling, and there were several different broadcasts about it that we related to. One story is not enough, and so on. But at some point we took a walk down this beautiful road near where we were, and there were these houses with people for governor, what's his name in Wisconsin? The conservative governor. And so the reaction is, oh, how horrible. And the woman had all this phenomenal Halloween stuff out, and she invited a group of us in. And she was the sweetest woman you could ever meet. And the reason I'm trying to say this, it was both right on the theme of the weekend we were on, and also what we're talking about here, that there's more than what you see. And not even is there more than one story, but there's more than two stories. There's lots that go into making people perceive things the way they do.
You're either a crappy person here, you're a crappy person there, and I'm not sure that someone's political views define who they are as a person, but that's kind of a controversial statement.
So what can we do about that?
It goes back to stories, you know? How I feel on a particular issue is based off of the things I've experienced as a human being, and how you feel about a particular issue is based off of the things you've experienced as a human being. And, you know, 30 years from now, we're going to be talking about a different social issue, but that's because of the way that we're experiencing life in this particular moment. And
what can we do to make it better?
Stop and listen. I think active listening is very much an underutilized tool, and if you stop thinking about what you have to say and start listening to what the other person is saying, you're going to have a way better perspective of what's happening right now. I found that in faculty as well. There's an extremely diverse faculty background, and so when I've gone and asked for help, so many different people came to their specific academic profession in such a different way, and they all have different pieces of advice to give me because they all experienced it differently, and they all work so well together because of that. They're able to understand what someone's specific research interest is and how they got to that and what their dissertation was and the stepping stones of their career. And all of the faculty that I've encountered at Roosevelt just want the same thing for me, and they just want me to reach my goals. So I think that's really cool about the diversity here as well.
Well, you just inspired me to talk about Professor George Watson, who was the head of the public administration program at Roosevelt. I never had a man in my life. My dad died when I was 11, and I just went on and was doing the things I had to do. And I got into the public administration curriculum in the undergraduate school, and we got connected, and sometimes I'd drive him to Hyde Park where he lived, and he just started talking with me the way no person ever talked to me before. And it wasn't about what I've been through, but it's about going forward. And he became the first head of public administration graduate program here at Roosevelt. And I just always thought he was the most important man in my life after my young years.
I have Dr. Elijah Ricks, who's my thesis mentor and my McNair mentor, and he's just gone beyond the call of duty in every single aspect. More than once I've started sobbing in his office, and he just so desperately wants me to get to where I want to be, and he's not really getting anything out of it. He just wants to see his students succeed, and that's something you don't get at a large institution, because that's not their goal. Their goal is to do research and publications, and when you're at a small university like this, you actually get to know your professors, and they get to know you, and they see where you are now and want to get you to where you want to be later, and that's a really cool relationship.
What strikes me based on our conversation is that one of the facets of Roosevelt University has been its focus not just on the academic background of the professors they've hired, but on the human background of the professors they've hired.